next edition of Fire Up, a Startup Insight series jointly by Succeed Innovation Fund and CIE, Tripedi Hyderabad. Today we have with us Ekta Bal. Ekta is a corporate lawyer and a very, very good friend of the, I meet her only in startup circles, though she has a life outside of startups. I've known her and met her only in the startup related events and activities. So quite actively engaged. Often it is just pro bono help. Ekta always is happy to answer questions and such and work with startups a lot. And so Ekta, thank you so much. And I think this topic is something, especially our audience, most of them are early stage startups. And this whole process is like, I know many startups, when they raise the funds for the first time, the whole process is so overwhelming. Partly because there's just too much paperwork, too many things to sign, too many things that they can't even make sense of, and partly also because they're not ready for it, especially when they do the first round of funding. So in the next 25 minutes, let's try and see if we can help them make sense out of this whole process. So just to get started, there are different stages of funding, right? I mean, there's the seed stage, angel stage, and then the series A, B, C, so on, BC funding. Is the process any different from any stage, or is it pretty much the same in all stages?
So if you look at it, I think there's one stage which is the most important. The way I look at it is actually the pre-seed stage, because that's where you actually start, and that's where your entrepreneurship journey starts, and that's where how you get your initial investment. Of course, that's not and that because we don't really speak about that because that's not formal. So you don't really have a formal investor who comes on board.
Huh.
It could be friends and family. It could be the founders. They're bootstrapping themselves. But even there, you have some sort of a documentation. Again, when you go to seed round, now seed again, when you talk about seed, it depends again on the nature of investors. Even on a seed round, not every time you have an institutional investor who's investing seed. It could be an individual angel who's investing. So while broadly the parameters of an investment cycle are the same, that you will have an agreement, the pre-agreement, whether I have a term sheet or I do a due diligence, that may vary. Okay, the depth and the details of the language or the jargon might vary, and that would depend on who your investor is really. So like if I have an angel who's sort of betting on the investor and is not keen on a large amount of paperwork, you'll probably see very sketchy documentation, which will not be very onerous in terms of obligations, responsibilities, liabilities. But even at this stage, if I look at an institutional investor, because they themselves have to answer to their investors and they have an institutional cycle of investment, those documents will be very different in terms of look, feel, manner, and even content. Again, from a due diligence perspective, there'll be some investors, because you're just started off, you're at a seed stage, they will not really get into too much of a in-depth due diligence. But as you move towards, maybe venture capital and you get into the series A, B, C, that's when you actually see a more in-depth diligence being done.
So the basic process remains the same, especially if it is an institutional fund.
Right.
The documentation terms will be similar. Of course, due diligence may be more in terms of when it comes to Series A.
Nuances will be there in terms of how you look at exit. So there might be certain nuances depending on the stage you are in. But you still look at the same nature. The nature of the documentation still stays broadly the same.
So what are the key steps in the process once the investor decides to invest? The major milestone, key steps in this process, what kind of documents get signed when, or what kind of activity happens when, at a very high level?
So, when you say that the investor agrees to invest, there are two things to say. For an investor also, is it the same saying, let's move ahead, let's get things sort of formalized? So when you say that let's get things formalized, the first thing parties typically do is sign an interim document. And that interim document can be called several things. It could be a letter of intent, it could be a term sheet, it could be an MOU, but it's basically an interim document that sort of sets out the broad contours of what the investment asks are of the investor. They speak about what the company's requirements are. But that's the nature of this thing, because as a founder, as a company, you need to be aware that you are looking at money coming from an external source. So they have certain expectations to safeguard that capital. And broadly, the terms and conditions will be with the intent to how do you safeguard that capital? What is required to broadly take care of that capital? Because it's capital that's coming to you for a particular purpose. So that broad document is first signed up. Once you sign the document, then you enter into, before signing the document, investors typically do some sort of a diligence, but it will be very broadly, it will be on documents which are largely in public domain. or based on pitch deck that you've given them, it'll be more Q&A. But once you sign the term sheet is when the detailed diligence starts. The diligence also, legal is only one aspect of it. Depending on the nature of industry, you could have a technical, you could have environmental, especially if you're in manufacturing and your manufacturing, your manufacturing requires, has a lot of environmental impact. There could be an environmental diligence done. There could be a technical diligence done just to make sure your facilities, etc., are of a particular standard. If you're very high on IP, there could be IP evaluation also done. There could be things to figure out, is your IP genuine and valid? Have you filed appropriate documents? Could there be, could there be infringement possibilities? So they'll actually do a specific IP diligences. Legal is only a small part of it then. Because we just have to look at, from a compliance perspective, are you kosher? What sort of documentation have you entered into with your customers, vendors? Are you broadly covered? What sort of a liability is there? Largely, and the purpose of a diligence eventually is to do a risk assessment. It's not that every diligence is clean and every diligence is completely mucky. Every diligence has issues, but what you do with those issues is then what those issues then translate into your transaction documents. Some of those issues, if they can be cleaned up, they'll be cleaned up. So they become something in the investment jargon we call a condition precedent. That means before the investor comes in, if it is significant in terms of a liability obligation, investors will ask you to satisfy or clean this up before they invest. Some of them, if they're minor, more from a corporate hygiene perspective, it'll get done after the investment, which translates to a condition subsequent. Deal breaker issues are very, very rare. And sometimes we've seen regulatory deal, which we thought were deal breaker issues, and we've actually figured out, the parties have commercially agreed a way around it. And if there's a company doing a business, investor is a foreign investor, and the business is not permitted under FDI regulations. There's a guy who say, oh God, this person's doing a business FDI. How will FDI happen? So they managed to restructure the company as a condition precedent, such that investment then comes into the legitimate business, permitted under FDI. The non-FDI or the non-FDI compliant business is moved into a separate entity, and a contractual relationship is then created.
Okay, so now when we talk about the LOI, the three types of documents, the LOI, MOU, and term sheet. Are there any differences between those three types?
I think it's more the form. It's how you have different kinds of books, so it's a different kind of form. But the general intent of them is the same, because they set out the broad parameters. So it'll talk about what is the cap on the investment amount. It'll talk about what sort of percentage of capital the investor will be entitled to. It'll talk broadly about what are the valuation terms. It'll talk about maybe if there's going to be a valuation adjustment. It'll talk about the exit strategies, because invariably investors, when they invest in a company, they look at an exit over a period of, typically it's between 3 to 7 years, depending on the life cycle of the fund of the investor. So they'll talk about how that exit has to take place. Are you looking at a strategic exit? Are you looking at it only through an IPO? Are the promoters also, do they have a obligation to buy those shares back? If nothing else happens, then is the investor free to sell his shares to a third party, but also get everybody else to sell, so that there's a complete sellout or a takeover of the company by a third party at the instance of the investor. So some of those conditions will actually come in very simple paragraphs. It'll probably be 1 or 2 paragraphs on each that highlight those terms in your interim document, and those are then found out in detail in your transaction documents, which will invariably.
The three documents, do they have any different form and purpose? LOI, MOU, or all three the same?
It's a format. The format changes. So one could be a tabular format. The other could be structured, where you talk about in an agreement form. Some will be just on a letterhead. But in gist, the content is more or less the same. What they're trying to what they speak about is the same.
So the starter may not worry, like I got an LOI but did not get the term sheet.
Correct, not at all.
So they're all mutually replaceable.
They're all interim documents, and so as a startup, what you need to be concerned about and think about it is, there's a clause there called exclusivity, which means that during that period, you are not free to talk to anybody else. So once you sign a term sheet, basically you've agreed to continue with the process with that investor, unless within that period of time, whether it's 60 days, 90 days, 130 days, you're not able to conclude signing of your definitive agreements, which is your binding agreement finally, which is the agreement under which the investment will happen.
So to that extent, term sheet is like a contract, at least for that period, that you at least commit that you will not look at anybody else.
To that extent, yes.
Okay. Now, when you talk about the legal due diligence, what all gets covered in it? Because it's a very broad term, and there are quite a few things that come under the purview of legal due diligence. So, what are some of the key things that they should be aware of and make sure it's ready, it's available?
So, when you look at a legal diligence, it covers everything that a company does, which requires legal compliance. And we talk about legal compliance. Legal compliance is not limited to the approvals you obtain, the filings you make. That's not the end of legal compliance. When you enter into contracts, there's a form and manner in which you agree on contracts. Contracts need to be stamped. And I'll give you a classic example, which typically turn out to be either indemnity obligations or a CP requirement. A lot of people take on leases, and those lease deeds are not stamped and registered. And if it is a critical facility of the company and you've not done it, now if you look at what is the outcome of that, if it is a non-compliance, that document can be impounded and there could be a penalty imposed on the company. And the penalty could be anywhere between 3% to 10% of the amount that was stampable as. Now, if you have a stamp duty implication of about, say, 1 lakh or 2, then if the document does get impounded, the impact on the company would be about 10 lakhs. So to mitigate that risk, then the investors will say, now you go and get that, either ratified, or you enter into a new document and make sure it's stamped and registered. But that time we come in. The other thing is, when you're scouting for when you're looking at your business and you're looking at investors, sometimes you're not sure of what your business is, that is it FDI compliant. And FDI is foreign investment, because while a domestic investor can invest in almost every sector, every business, if it's a foreign investor, which most funds investing in India today have monies which are coming out of India, there are certain regulatory restrictions or conditions that need to be satisfied for that investment to come through. So understanding of your business to see whether you can get that investment or not, or rather than realize, maybe 2 months down the path, and then you're worrying about what to do. Because when you worry about what to do, you might be able to still get a transaction, but it'll impact your valuation, because only part of your business then will get the money, if you're able to, work around structures. So when you're looking at diligence, those are issues that really come about, because we will look at it from an investor's perspective. So what is the business itself something in which investment can happen?
Now you mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, continue.
No, I was saying you mentioned the whole lease agreements. Now, there are a lot of contracts. It could be a partnership contract, or agreement, could be a sales contract, or could be any number of documents, even employment contract. What are all the types of agreements or contracts that a starter should be aware of? Because often they think like, look, I sent an email to the person and the person joined and I've been paying salary. They may not realize that email doesn't constitute an employment offer. So what are the types of contracts that the starters need to be mindful of?
So simple thing, like when you send an email, when you look at a contract, an offer and an acceptance is typically a contract under the Contract Act. So when we look at contracts, you look at if there's a conflict, how will I be able to secure my rights and obligations? So while, I might say that that person's an employee, but there would be certain things that you need to protect yourself all as a company. And a simple example is, and every startup, invariably, irrespective of business, has proprietary technology or proprietary information. That is your confidential information. How are you safeguarding that? One is in good faith saying that, you came, you worked for me, you went. So that will talk about, it'll take care of your HR requirements, maybe from the payment of salaries, etc. But how are you safeguarding your information? So for that, you need to have a detailed confidentiality clause. And how are you recording that? You may not have an employment contract, but do you have a non-disclosure agreement? If your employees are working on technologies for the company, okay, how do you establish that they don't tomorrow use that IP in their name? Tomorrow, if you need to file a patent, how can you show that that technology, even the moral rights to the technology, because that employee has worked, how do you say that the company has ownership? So there has to be a transfer assignment of those moral rights even to the company. So typically, depending on the technology, if somebody is working heavily on information which has strong IP rights, you want to make sure that you have your adequate documentation. And I'm not saying it has to be only an employment contract, but you need to make sure that your downsides are safe, are protected in terms of what matters to the company. Your confidentiality language, the fact that you need to have, your assignment of rights. It could be, tomorrow if you leave the company, I might not have a problem you leaving the company, but you should not poach my customers. You should not go and set up, so there are companies who've taken a view that they don't want to have any non-compete restrictions because everybody's free to work wherever they want to, which is a commercial call that a company can take. It's because at the end of the day, it's the vision and belief of a company. But to what extent can the employee who's leaving go after your customers and existing employees? So then you want to consider something like a non-solicit. And some of these clauses will work with every agreement that you look into. But more often than not, what startups face is where they work with a large conglomerate which throws down contracts which are non-negotiable. And you're stuck with them. So it's very important for a startup to actually understand those contracts, because at the end of the day, there's a risk mitigation. Contracts is about you could agree on everything. Sometimes the business demands you to sign an extremely onerous contract. But what have you done in terms of risk mitigation? Because when you come to an investment contract, you cannot change contract terms. But what happens is that if there's a loss for something else, the investor will ask you to indemnify. And what helps you tomorrow in case of any such, suppose the market turns and you're slapped with the liability. Mitigation, how you've mitigated the risk, really, holds you in good stead.
So some of these may go into the agreement as an indemnity clause.
So indemnity clause, but mitigation can happen. Do I have adequate insurance? So tomorrow there's a default. Do I have an insurance coverage of a third-party insurance or a contract liability insurance, which if a customer sues me, my insurance pays it. So company is not out of pocket. Or company is negligibly out of pocket.
So now when we talk about, like, say, partnership contracts or or channel contracts or any kind of relationship contracts that are central to the business, I mean, not just lease, but more operational in nature. Are there, I mean, you did mention one point, large companies tend to push non-negotiable terms that may be a little bit detrimental to the startup. But are there other things to be aware of in these large contracts? I mean, not large contracts, the relationship contracts.
So you need to also look at which side of the relationship you're in. Are you the one who is getting something out of it, where you've engaged someone? Are you engaging someone? And in either case, eventually, when you're looking at relationship, it is for a purpose objective, and the objective of that will be either creating value. And eventually, when you look at, and I'm breaking down a contract, so I don't want to get into, clauses of a contract, but every part, whether you call it channel contract, a partnership contract, or a collaboration contract, it's all about creating a value. And that value is, how do you commercialize that value? And who owns that value? So I think when you look at all these three things, the startup should be very clear about what is it they're looking for in each of those value propositions, and is it recorded in writing exactly how you want it to be. So it could be a value proposition where you have no rights. It's fine, but you should be very clear about it. And if your understanding is that you have to have rights, you should be very particular that the language is not ambiguous on it. Because tomorrow, in case of a dispute, then your right is questioned. For example, if you've created a joint product, it could be that the ownership in the product will be with one of the parties, and the other party just gets a revenue share. Now, the party who's got ownership rights will have to make sure, the startup who has ownership rights has to make sure that the document is very clear on how ownership rights are recorded. And puts enough obligations on the other party to make sure that they don't do anything with respect to that product or to create another product. If there's a startup which actually has rights to a revenue share, we need to ensure that he has absolute visibility on where how the revenue is generated. And how, because see, when you're looking at revenue share, it could be something that I've licensed it to somebody else. And I'm giving a small license fee, and I'm only giving you a percentage of that. And that license actually is given to a related party, and that person commercializes it and gets a revenue. So you then need to look at, for a person who's then looking at a revenue share, is how am I going to really look at the revenue? Can that be misused? Can I put in checks and balances there? Say that you cannot, if you're licensing to a related party or to an affiliate, then that person's revenue also forms part of my revenue share. Do I look at, conditions like that?
So that's
And
interesting.
then, so something, so you need to look at where is it that your value lies, and you need to be very clear on your value, because eventually your value in that contract adds to your valuation.
So value, rights, obligations, and clauses to prevent any abuse.
The next thing is in terms of liability. Now, liability, typically you have capped liability and you have uncapped liability. Law says you can only look at actual losses, damages, etc. But actual losses in some contracts can actually be much higher than what you've received as consideration. Now, ideally, you should always limit the liability that you have. But in some contracts, it's not possible to limit that liability. So now, if there's a commercial call taken that you cannot limit the liability and you have to live with the contract like that, then you need to make sure that you have adequate insurance to cover that risk too. Okay, I see a lot of startups saying that the insurance is very expensive. But the challenge is that if you get hit with a liability, that's more expensive for your company. And how will you then meet it? So startups need to take a call and see that at least before you look at investment, or at the time when the investment comes, at some stage, you need to have an insurance policy put in place, or have a strategy put in place as to how are you going to mitigate your risks from contract.
So, you're saying even early stages, it's good to take insurance in case.
If it's possible. If it's not possible, at least start having a strategy. Start speaking to an insurance provider to figure out when they can do it, and will it cover previous contracts as well. How you can get those in the loop as well later. But you should be aware of it. At least start having those conversations with people who can give you genuine information.
So the other thing that, contract is one, but the other place that we often, I've come across cases is like the original founders agreement was not either in place or not drafted well. How important is that document?
So let's look at this. The founders shape a company, and you can actually make and break a company because of how you internally deal with issues yourselves. And we brought up to say that and most founders come from a place of a relationship, and in relationships we are typically not accustomed to asking difficult questions. Now, when you're talking about founders agreements, now when typically people come to me and say, give me a founders agreement, I can give you a plain vanilla agreement which talks about certain rights, obligations, etc. But typically a founders agreement, a good founders agreement, which probably will stand the test of time and help not just the contractual portion but also help the founders understand where each of them come from, is actually asking those difficult questions. And the difficult questions have to start when you start incorporating the company, when you start thinking about the business together. Because if you look at life, we don't know where the future is. None of us know tomorrow. Everybody gets into an entrepreneurial journey, but it's not. Some people are able to sustain it. Some people are not. Some people have other priorities which pull them away from business. Some people start viewing business, because even if you look at any startup, and one of the things which is taught is that if your business is not viable, you need to reinvent yourself. Now, when you got into the journey, you thought about a business with only one, with blinders. And when it has to pivot, at that point, you could actually have differences. Okay. Now, if a founder start a conflict at that point in time, well, they also suffer, but eventually the company suffers and nobody gets anything out of it. So eventually, you look at a founder's agreement, it's a continuous discussion that starts, you sign something, at the time when you started, but you need to have continuous discussions over a period of time. And if required, keep amending that document that you've created. See that what is it that we're looking at in the company, because that document actually talk about the ethos of the company, your vision for the company, how you look at your relationships, intersect each other. Because that's a healthy.
What are some of the key terms that go into the founders agreement?
So broadly, you look at it, key terms will be what is the role and responsibility of each person? What do you bring on the table? And the challenge becomes is that some of the values that each of the founders bring, some of it can be measured in terms of quantum. If somebody's responsibility is a sale and marketing, their value can be measured in terms of how many sales have you done. But there are some roles, like if there's a partner who's very good with administration, how do you measure their performance? How do you measure and say this is what your value is?
Huh.
And you know, some of these things are which bring about issues also when you speak about founders' issues. Because if the company is doing great sales, you know, some people say that I deserve more because I've actually taken the company from 0 to 100. What have you done? But unfortunately for that founder, that value really is not measurable in terms of absolute numbers. So the partners have to have that discussion up front that when you have a value which can be given and there's a value which is not really measurable in numbers, we need to figure out how to value that. And that value has to be given. Because invariably what happens is sometimes partners start feeling that, you know, I'm bringing more, you're not doing anything. And they don't really figure out that you've done a journey together. So your roles, your responsibilities, how do you want to even measure what you bring in? Or bring out which is roles, responsibilities. If you want to measure it, how do you measure it? The most important thing is that if either party wants to leave, how is that exit going to be handled?
That's something that's a big problem I've seen at least few startups that went south.
I come from a perspective, so this is something which is very close to my heart because it's something that, you know, I work with a lot in terms of things. So, you know, everybody knows about the fact that there's a dispute, let's go to court. Not many people are aware that, you know, even the law is changing, saying that if you have a dispute, use the court as a last option. So you actually have in 2018, the Commercial Courts Act was actually modified to say here if you have a commercial dispute, please try pre-institutional mediation.
Arbitration and such.
So once you file the documents in court, you please go try mediation. Try to resolve the dispute. If you can't resolve the dispute, come back to court, but try to talk it out. In fact, yesterday, the Supreme Court has actually questioned the center, saying, what are you doing to make pre-litigation mediation mandatory? So mediation is basically a process where parties try to communicate and sort the dispute out before going to court. So it's about dialogue. And that dialogue doesn't need you to actually get into a mediation segment. A dialogue can happen because of people and you've spent a journey together. So managing that exit becomes all the more important because if you manage an exit well, a company's value is retained, maintained, and the party who's exiting also gets value. But if you fight,
no heartburn,
So if you fight because of your dispute, the company's performance suffers, and neither party really exits happy or with even value added to it.
And do these agreements also have earned value? I mean, like, will their proportional holding change based on things that they do, typically in the founder agreement?
It could, and that depends on the dialogue that parties have. So no founders agreement should be the same as another founders agreement. You shouldn't have a cut copy. And it's very important for founders to actually have that conversation because then they know where they're coming from. Not that they realize what the other party meant at the time when they start discussing an exit or when things go down south. A healthy founders agreement is actually one which is drafted after founder conversation. Otherwise, it's just templatized and nobody knows what the document means.
So, with just a few more minutes, from an investment process standpoint, what should they be? I mean, compliance, we just briefly touched upon it on the ROC compliance, but accounting and such, what are some of the things the startups need to be mindful of before they go looking for funds?
See, founders have to realize that the company is distinct from themselves. So it's not me and my pocket. It's very distinct. So whatever you do, make sure adequate records are maintained. In case of doubt, always speak to, if you're not financially literate, make sure you have a good accountant who sort of understands financial language and can educate you on it. Your auditor, always make sure that you get their advice at every stage, not only at the time of investment, because cleaning up financial messes in the past can actually lead to a lot of, not just in terms of valuation erosion from the company, it could also lead a lot of expenditure because if you're cleaning up something 3 years down the line, the cost that you will incur is much higher. So financial literacy for an entrepreneur is very important.
So in the least, they should engage a good accountant, a good CA.
The first thing that a startup should do is make sure that they have a good financial consultant who's on board. And I'm not saying on board as an employee, but somebody you've engaged who can advise you on how you should manage financial documentation.
I mean, I see oftentimes like startups struggling. They have to go recreate the records. They don't have the records, and
Correct.
so I tell one thing I give to startups saying, until you have a proper accountant, at least make sure all your transactions happen only from your account. At least the bank record is something that you can go back and build the documentation around. So Ekta, this has been fantastic. I know this topic is such, half an hour is just not enough for something like this. We normally take a few questions today. I don't think we have time for that even. But this is something that will take, I'm sure any startup will have tons of questions to ask. We'll probably do another session. Yeah, Ekta, you're going to say something.
I was just saying that if anybody has questions, if they mail it across to you, you can mail me a consolidated questions. I'd be happy to answer them and send it back to you.
Absolutely.
So happy to answer them even through mail.
We'll do that. Pragya, so make a note. I think we can just post a message saying anybody has questions, just put it. We'll collect everything and send it to Ekta, get the answers, and then send it to the startup. So Ekta, thank you so much. You've always been a fantastic help. Anytime we seek any time from you, we are always willing. Thanks. And we'll probably do, if we get a lot of interest, maybe we can do a Q&A session sometime where it's just startups ask questions. We can do like set up some time and do that.
A closed group conversation where we can discuss specific issues that startups have. Not a problem at all.
We'll do that. We'll do that. Thank you so much, Ekta. And thank you to all the participants. Thank you.